Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the um, Institute of Historical Research History of Gardens and Landscape Seminar. This is the last one of the summer term, and we're delighted you're here. I'm Michael Ann Mullen, one of the conveners, as most of you know by now. And I'm just going to go through the drill about technical things. Would you please mute yourselves now and turn off your videos? And then I must remind you to please submit your questions at the end by through the chat box, and then Pippa will convey them to Stephanie, and we can have a kind of discussion of sorts that way. Not perfect, but anyway, we're delighted to have Stephanie here, and it'll be great. So Pippa's now going to introduce Stephanie.
Hi. Well, I don't know if there's anyone here this evening who heard Stephanie speak in November 2019. It was one of those almost long forgotten events. It was a real live, in-person, in the flesh seminar, a forgotten item. We had hoped to follow that paper up with a visit to Ham in the following summer 2020, but that obviously wasn't going to happen. But now we're very hopeful that there will be a visit on October the 6th this year, so please pencil that into your diaries. And it's to set the scene for that visit that Stephanie's very kindly agreed to present an updated version of her last paper, giving particular emphasis to the connections to be found between the galleries and gardens at Ham House. So to Stephanie herself, she completed her PhD at the School of Museum Studies at Leicester University. And it's there that she was involved with a project funded by the Leverhulme Trust, which saw her research focus on the interconnections between art galleries and early modern gardens. Since then, she's been a teaching fellow at the Museum of Studies at Leicester. So this evening, we've got the benefit of hearing more about her research and what is really a fascinating subject. So thank you very much, Stephanie. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Pippa, and thank you everyone for coming. Good evening. I'd also like to thank the staff at Ham House, in particular Rosie Files and Hannah Maudsley, for so generously giving up their time to talk about the research that I've been doing, and also to support me in my teaching at the school. I'd also like to thank my family for encouraging a love of gardens from a young age, and it's really great to have this opportunity to continue our conversations, I think. So this presentation, as Pippa says, will examine some of the relationships which existed between galleries and and gardens during the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, with a particular focus on Ham House and Gardens, which is a 17th century courtier's house in Richmond, now managed by the National Trust. The presentation is divided into 4 parts. In the first part, I'll begin with an introduction to my research interests. I will then provide a brief overview of the research project and why I decided to examine the subject. In the second part, I'll offer
Excuse
some...
me, you couldn't be sweet enough to tell me how I get the volume on the Zoom.
Sorry, I'll continue. A bit of background noise there. In the second part, I'll offer some thoughts on and examples of the spaces of art that existed in the early modern period, and in particular what constituted a gallery in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, as this term is quite nebulous. Next, I'll explore some of the different types of relationships which existed between gardens and galleries in early modern Europe, including spatial, social and conceptual relationships. And finally, I'll examine some of the architectural and spatial relationships between gardens and display spaces at Ham House in more detail. So just to say a little bit about me, I am a historian of museums and galleries, and my training is in history and museology. I have worked and volunteered at a number of UK museums and heritage institutions, including the Royal Collection in London and the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And as Pippa mentioned, my PhD examined the concepts and visual strategies employed within 16th and 17th century curiosity cabinets to represent the world, and investigated how those concepts and strategies were echoed in contemporary art practice from 1990 onwards in Europe and the USA. And this image here shows a reconstruction of the 18th century cabinet of art and natural curiosities at the Stiftungen Institute in Halle in Germany. And that is a stuffed Nile crocodile that you're looking at there. So broadly speaking, I'm interested really in visual representation and cultural performances and how these develop and intersect with others across time. And I'm particularly interested in how past forms, concepts, and strategies of visual representation influence those of later periods in history. So the research on which this presentation is based was conducted as part of a 3-year project called Cultivating the Art Gallery in the Early Modern Garden. This was funded by the Leverhulme Trust and hosted by the School of Museum Studies at Leicester. I'm currently working on a book manuscript entitled Theatres of Art, A Cultural History of the Early Modern Gallery and Garden. However, this research is to some extent still in progress, and it really situates itself at the intersection of garden and museum and gallery cultures during the 16th, 17th and early 18th centuries. Today, museums and galleries constitute a very widely recognised set of cultural practices which are performed in lots of different ways across the world. But it's arguably during the early modern period that we begin to see them emerge as distinct cultural forms in Europe. However, they were not always expressed as forms we would immediately recognise today. And one of the reasons for this is because they did not operate in an isolated as part of an isolated cultural performance, but were shaped by others. So this research explores the relationships and connections between art galleries and gardens in England before the advent of the purpose-built public gallery. And the principal aim of the research is to understand the emergence and development of the early modern art gallery through a comparative study of the social and visual performances of the garden. The project focuses on England, but also references influential developments in garden and gallery design and use elsewhere in Europe during the same period, and particularly in Italy, France, and the Netherlands. Slides slightly out of order there, sorry. So the objectives of the research are to establish the governing concepts of early modern gardens and how and to what extent these intersected with those of gallery spaces, to understand how gardens were spatially configured in relation to galleries, to illuminate the visual and architectural relationships between interior and exterior spaces of display, and to compare the lived experience of gardens and galleries. In terms of methods, a lot of my evidence derives from conducting archival research on early modern museums, galleries and gardens, which has involved looking at documents such as inventories, letters, bills and receipts, as well as maps, plans and drawings, in order to get a sense of how specific spaces appeared and how they were furnished and how one physically moved in and between them, how they were used and who by, and how they've changed over time. This and additional primary sources, such as early modern books on art and gardening, has also helped me to understand how early modern people were thinking about these spaces and what sorts of conceptual models they were using. This has been complemented with research into objects in museum collections, particularly examples of material culture depicting buildings and gardens from the period. This image is a close-up of a fruit tree taken from a three-dimensional model of a 17th century garden in an embroidered casket, which is in the V&A. And I'm hoping to publish an article on this very soon for Textile History. Finally, the research has involved conducting field visits to surviving and restored buildings and landscapes in the UK and Italy, France and the Netherlands, and a particular focus has really been on elite spaces such as royal palaces and stately homes and gardens. And really foremost among this has been Ham House, which I will talk about in more detail later. So why investigate the relationship between gardens and galleries? The impetus to do so originated with my doctoral study of curiosity cabinets defined as privately owned collections of extraordinary objects. And towards the end of that project, it really became evident from the way in which early modern people articulated the complex set of practices that made up collecting activity, that firstly, they thought of gardens and collections as being natural partners. Many early modern collectors possessed gardens and often articulated these as being integral components of spaces used to represent the world through the display and interpretation of objects. This is also reflected in visitors' descriptions of collectors' homes, where collections were usually displayed. The English collector and gardening enthusiast John Evelyn, for example, described the whole house and garden of his friend Sir Thomas Browne as being, and I quote, a paradise and a cabinet of rarities. Similarly, the Orto Botanico at Pisa, one of the earliest university botanic gardens, which was built between 1543 and 1544, was moved several times, and in its third incarnation of the late 16th century installed a galleria. This displayed natural historical specimens as well as comprising a library, a herbarium, and displaying paintings, which included representations of plants and portraits of illustrious botanists. So even from their earliest inception, museums and galleries are quite often being seen and experienced together. They are proximate and codependent. Secondly, the gardens of elite early modern Europeans were culturally rich sites. So contemporary commentators like Evelyn reveal that as well as exhibiting exotic specimens of plants and animals, gardens frequently displayed statues, inscriptions, antiquities, and even mural paintings. Indeed, some were so richly ornamented that in a letter to Thomas Browne in 1658, Evelyn complained that in London, our Cockney gardens and plots appear like gardens of pasteboard and marchpane and smell more of paint than of flowers and verdure. Thirdly, gardens and art galleries have traditionally been examined as separate cultural entities. However, there is considerable evidence to suggest that the early modern people understood and experienced the visual, spatial, and social performances of the gallery and garden as fundamentally entwined. While scholars of garden history such as Roy Strong and John Dixon Hunt have recognised and noted the connections between early modern gardens, museums, and theatres since the late 1970s and early 1980s, to date, there's still not very much in-depth scholarship on the nature of the relationship between gardens and galleries. So moving on to think a little bit more about art and the spaces of art in the early modern period, I think it's helpful to pause and just briefly consider what really constituted an art collection, where you would typically have encountered artworks, and what is meant by the term gallery. So art collections in this period were diverse in nature and often encompassed paintings, sculptures, tapestries, and antiquities, but might also extend into the collecting of quite different types of materials, such as natural specimens. And this led to the development of quite specialised display practices, such as auricular theatres, which were popular during the 17th and 18th centuries and often took the form of open display cabinets with graduated shelving so that these small alpine plants could be displayed at different heights. Before the advent of the public art gallery, as we know it today, and that's usually referenced in this country as the first public purpose-built art gallery being the Dulwich Art Gallery, which I think opens to the public in 1817, built by Sir John Soane. But before that time, works of art broadly defined were displayed in a really diverse variety of settings and for a number of different purposes. So paintings and sculptures could be encountered in private houses and gardens, in churches, livery company halls, city gates, public squares, and later in print shops and academies. Works of art were also displayed in public pleasure gardens from the late 17th century onwards, which admitted the public for a fee. These included Voxel gardens, first launched as the New Spring Garden, which displayed paintings by William Hogarth and Francis Hayman in its supper boxes. This image that you can see here is an early 19th century pen and ink rendering of Hogarth painting in Voxel Gardens, overseen by Jonathan Tyers, who was the proprietor. The word gallery is quite liberally applied to the physical containers of art collections during this entire period, alongside other terms such as cabinet, closet, museum, and theatre. However, like these terms, it was applied very broadly and it was often used in quite different ways. So sometimes the word gallery is used as in a purely architectural sense to describe several different types of structures. In Renaissance Italy, for example, it tends to describe an open loggia or roofed walk, open to the elements on one side, whereas in the colder climates of France and England, a gallery tended to denote a long rectangular room lit by windows. Richard Holloway defined the gallery in his dictionary of 1552 quite simply as a building made outward in prospect, which suggests that these spaces embodied an innate desire to link exterior with interior. At other times, the word gallery was used in a more functional and performative sense to describe a place for exercise and recreation. Indoor long galleries, as they became known, were common features of Tudor and Stuart houses, and some scholars, such as Rosalis Coupe, have suggested that they were relatives of the medieval Great Hall or monastic cloister. However, they were not initially a space whose purpose was primarily to display paintings and sculptures. This is Little Morton Hall in Cheshire, another National Trust property. And this house was constructed initially as a two-storey dwelling in the early 16th century, to which the long gallery was added in the 1580s, creating the third storey, which you can see here. And this is a very, very fashionable, very desirable and highly expensive architectural feature, which runs from one end of the house to the other. And you can probably see that it's caused a bit of sag as well as the weight of the building and the structure and the glass has caused a little bit of a problem there. So long galleries such as this one enjoyed a really intimate relationship with the exterior landscape that they looked out upon. These spaces were frequently positioned on the upper floors or piano nobile of houses overlooking gardens, or sometimes even in the gardens themselves, as John Evelyn tells us. The interior of this space features heraldic designs on the windows and decorative plasterwork, including curling vines and images of fortune and destiny at either end of the gallery, but it would have been quite sparsely furnished in its own day to allow room for exercise and games. We've actually, tennis balls from the 16th century have been discovered in this space, so we know that it was used for quite vigorous exercise despite all this glass. It was essentially a means of bringing the outdoor world inside, but its iconography also suggests that it was intended to encourage those who utilised the space to reflect upon the exterior world without. We can get a sense of the kinds of spaces used to display art and their close relationship with gardens from these pendant portraits by the Dutch artist Daniel Mittens, painted in about 1618. Here we see two famous 17th century collectors, Thomas and Alethea Howard, husband and wife, depicted against the backdrop of two galleries, both of which open out onto exterior spaces. Thomas gestures with his staff on the left towards a barrel-vaulted gallery containing classical sculptures on plinths, and at the far end of the gallery, a balcony overlooks the River Thames. Alethea sits before a portrait gallery, which opens out onto a walled garden with a fountain. These portraits are thought to represent the no longer extant Arundel House in the Strand, whose picture and sculpture galleries were constructed prior to 1616, the picture gallery on the lower floor and the sculpture gallery above it. Mittens has depicted these rooms as idealised versions, as being far grander, larger and more modern than they really were. However, the close relationship that they depict between gallery and garden is substantiated by contemporary visitors. So a contemporary description reports that when Thomas was presented with a head of Jupiter by Sir Dudley Carleton, he placed it, and I quote, in his utmost garden, so opposite the gallery doors, as being open so soon as you enter into the front garden, you have the head in your eye all the way. So in a way, these paintings speak a truth that is not literal but performative, just as the eye is drawn to the depicted exterior through the artist's use of linear single-point perspective, so would the visitor, the would-be visitor rather in this case, is drawn through the gallery by the visual lure and promise of the garden and must traverse this space before exiting and embarking on another kind of encounter with art. The philosopher and courtier Francis Bacon, who was a frequent visitor to Arundel House, was so staggered when he walked out into the garden full of ancient statues of naked men and women that he apparently cried out, "The resurrection." Bacon's reaction, if it can be attributed to him, suggests that the experience of visiting ancient artworks set in a modern London garden on the Thames would have been really novel. Historians have noted that Thomas Howard was one of the first English collectors to use his garden as a space for the display of sculptures inspired by his travels in Italy. While this is technically accurate, there's also something slightly problematic about this statement, as it suggests that it simply occurred to English collectors to start displaying things outside, whereas these portraits, although idealised, suggest a more complex relationship between gardens and galleries and between internal and external spaces. Gardens, oh, sorry, I just want to show you a close-up of these two spaces. So you can see a little bit more detail, hopefully. You can see on the left-hand side a railing overlooking the Thames with the landscape beyond. And in the Duchess's garden, you can see an arbour with what looks like a little fountain in the centre as well. So gardens could actually themselves function as outdoor galleries. And the word gallery was also applied quite frequently to covered walks or arbours in gardens like the one we've just seen in the Daniel Mittens portrait. This is an image I took of an arbour or berceau reconstructed from a French design in the Queen's Garden at Palace Het Loo in Apeldoorn in the Netherlands. It comprises a series of walkways with window openings, and its superstructure has been overgrown with hornbeam. Here, Queen Mary could walk with her ladies, ostensibly so that she was protected from the weather, and particularly sunburn, but also because it provided a private place to walk and talk, and framed views and vistas of the garden and palace from its many windows and entrances. As you can see, these spaces could be incredibly creative and ambitious architecturally speaking. They did resemble galleries, but they were also architectural structures in their own right, which must have created an intimate experience somewhere between a hedge maze, a wilderness, and a gallery. Indeed, Francis Bacon directly compared the function of these spaces with those of the Long Gallery in his 1625 essay of Gardens, when he observed that in such a space you may walk as in a gallery. Gardens and galleries also had complementary functions. The excerpt from the poem that forms the title of this paper is from the mid-16th century, attributed to George Cavendish, the servant and biographer of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. When Cavendish wrote this verse in the late 1560s, he was probably not thinking about art galleries as we would define them today. Instead, he was probably describing the magnificence of Wolsey's long galleries at York Place and Hampton Court Palace, both no longer extant, spaces which were used for walking, entertaining, and conducting business. The poem highlights the architectural and spatial characteristics of galleries and gardens in the 16th century, as well as giving us a sense of the social function of both. And I'll read this little bit for you. So he says, "My galleries were fair, both large and long, to walk in them when that it liked me best. My gardens sweet, enclosed with walls strong, embanked with benches to sit and take my rest. The knots so ennotted it cannot be expressed, with arbours and alleys so pleasant and so dulce, the pestilent airs with flavours to repulse." In this poem, then, galleries are associated with walking and exercise, but the garden is associated with relaxation and sensory pleasure, particularly in terms of the visual delight and skillful construction of a knot garden, but also in terms of the sensory experiences of gardens, particularly the sense of smell. The garden is also associated with health and well-being. Fragrant air was thought to guard against bad air, or miasma, which was believed to transmit diseases. Crucially, both gardens and galleries were linked to Tudor notions of privacy. In elite households, then, gardens and galleries shared an important function of furnishing a semi-private space in which to walk and talk, as well as places to entertain guests. The poem also highlights their symbolic function. The garden is conceived of almost as a fortified place protected by walls strong. This has links to late medieval images of the Marian garden and to the Garden of Eden, but also has a political dimension, as England itself was sometimes compared to a walled garden. During the same period, gardens and galleries were being linked conceptually in contemporary discourse, and we can see an example of this in the title of a book by the Puritan theologian William Fulke, published in 1571. The frontispiece is shown here, and its full title is "A goodly gallery with a most pleasant prospect into the garden of natural contemplation, to behold the natural causes of all kinds of meteors." It's actually a really interesting book if you ever want to read it. It's he talks about the causes of dragons and all kinds of things like that. And some things are ascribed to divine causes and some things to more natural causes. But what's really interesting, I think, about this title is that here Fulk actually uses that spatial relationship between the gallery and the garden as a metaphor for the gallery as an ideal vantage point from which to gain a deeper knowledge of the world, in this case, natural phenomena. And that knowledge can only be gained by ascending to the gallery and then looking out through the physical and symbolic lens that it creates. In many early modern gardens and long galleries, this was also literally true. 16th and 17th century, and even to an extent 18th century gardens were often conceived of as a series of compartments or rooms without ceilings, bordered by hedges or walls. The most formal gardens were modelled on the patterns of complex embroideries, and their designs could only be fully appreciated from a height, which is why such gardens were typically located close to the house. So this image, in a detail taken from a photograph by the National Trust photographer John Hammond, depicts a view into a restored 17th century garden at Ham House. This garden is based on a design of 1671, or an interpretation of this design, and it's bordered by hornbeam arbours and has been given the appearance of a geometric garden planted with lavender and santolina shaped into domes and pyramids and surrounded by miniature box hedges and bordered by quite straight, narrow gravel paths. The cherry garden was so called because at one time 84 cherry trees grew here, some against the walled enclosure of the space. Only the Duchess of Lauderdale, who we'll meet in a minute, and her most intimate friends and family members would have had access to this space, which could be reached directly through a double glazed door from the White Closet, a private closet that was downstairs and another very exclusive space. This garden was, in a sense, an extension of the private closet, and the 1679 inventory indicates that this garden was adorned with a good deal of furniture, including a marble statue on a stone pedestal, 12 flower pots of stone on stone pedestals, 10 flower pots of gilt lead, and 10 wooden stools with benches painted. The statue of Bacchus, which you can just see here, is the only garden statue to survive from the Duchess's era, and its presence here suggests that this was a space of pure pleasure and sensory delight. Although this image was taken from a staircase and not a gallery, it demonstrates the necessity of vantage points over formal gardens. From here, we're able to take in the entire garden at a glance and appreciate its complex patterns. However, the sense of control this view affords the beholder is partly a deception in which the gallery is complicit, because gardens were not made simply to be looked at, of course, they're made to be experienced. And in his history of walking, Joseph Amato observes the manner in which formal gardens were designed to choreograph movement and behaviour. He contends that geometric paths, and I quote, surfaced with fine gravel or paved stone, performed a dual function. Firstly, they smoothed the lord and lady's way, and secondly, they transformed the act of walking or strolling into what he calls a kind of mannered dance. So you could also argue that partly these spaces are a little bit about control and even surveillance. Mark Leone takes this idea a little bit further. Seen from an archaeological rather than an iconographical perspective, Leone argues that in such a space, the stroller is effectively a captive of the garden. I think this also raises questions about what is really on display in such environments. Perhaps the real exhibitionary object is not the visual, but the performative. This garden puts people on display just as much as people are displaying objects such as plants and sculptures in the garden. So I'd now like to turn my attention more fully to Ham House, as this furnishes a really intriguing example of how these architectural, spatial and conceptual relationships were performed within a single setting. So I'll just tell you a little bit more about the site. Ham, as I mentioned, is a National Trust property, and it comprises an exceptionally well-preserved network of mostly late 17th century interior spaces, many of which were used for the display of paintings. There is a long gallery full of portraits, which you might expect, but also a series of smaller, more intimate cabinet spaces and closets, including one which opens directly out into the geometric garden we saw earlier, the White Closet. Furthermore, there is a comparable network of garden spaces which were used to display sculptures as well as exotic plants such as orange and lemon trees. And just to give you a sense of where that long gallery is, if you're looking at the house and you look over to the doorway and then cast your gaze off to the right, you'll see a sort of little arch there, a little loggia. Just above that, that's the level where the gallery is. The window just above the arch is the green closet, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then the bay window right over to the right, with the sculptures in pedestals below it, that is one of the arms of the gallery which runs in the other direction. So what we see here is, of course, the front of the house, which is built in 1610. Ham is located just 200 metres from the banks of the Thames, so during the 17th century it could have been accessed by road or barge. Visitors would then progress up a long tree-lined avenue before entering this forecourt seen here. This space has changed with the times. The lead busts, which you can see on the house, which largely represent Roman emperors, but there are also representations of, for example, King Charles I. These were added later in the 1670s, and the statue of the river god is an 18th century addition, and much of the landscaping at the front of the house really preserves a more 18th century appearance. Ham itself is named for the district in which it's located, which in turn may derive from the Old English word hammer, meaning land or settlement on the bend of a river. Its position here is deeply symbolic because it's located very close to the site of Richmond Palace, which is no longer there. And that is where the monarch would retreat to hunt or escape the plague, which was endemic to the city of London at the time. This part of the river was once filled with courtiers' houses and was part of the royal processional route into and out of London in the 17th century. So in order to understand Ham, it's really important to understand that wider landscape in which it sits. Ham was originally built for Sir Thomas Vavasour, who was a courtier of James I, but was given, or leased rather, by King Charles I to William Murray, one of his gentlemen of the bedchamber and childhood friend, in 1626. Charles was an enthusiastic art collector, and William also collected art and had copies made of some of the paintings in the king's collection. Murray's eldest daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1626, later Countess of Dysart in her own right, and later still Duchess of Lauderdale by marriage, spent a lot of her time here, and finally dying at Ham at the age of 72 in 1698. This detail from a double portrait by Sir Peter Lely of about 1675 depicts Elizabeth and her second husband, John Maitland, Duke of Lauderdale and Secretary of State for Scotland. This image depicts them at the height of their wealth and influence. Together, they carried out an extensive renovation of Ham and its grounds during the 1670s. They spent vast amounts of money on building and decorating, but also on furniture, fine art and gardening. And much of this impetus appears to have come from Elizabeth herself. So what I'd like to do now in this final part of the presentation is to take you through some of the principal sites used for the display of collections at Ham and what we can tell about how they were used. So if we go back to the front of the house and have a closer look at the loggia spaces, so the house itself is slightly elevated and there is a staircase up which one must proceed. And on either side of the porch, which most of which was later taken down, stand two loggias. So in the 1679 inventory of goods at Ham, these spaces are referred to as the Cloisters. The Cloisters were part of the 1610 house, but may have been rebuilt in the late 19th century. These are small rectangular spaces supported partly by columns, open on two sides with black and white tiled floors. Their inner walls are painted with perspective paintings designed to fool the eye into believing that they are seeing a much larger outdoor gallery itself overlooking a landscape. Thus, no matter what way the visitor turns, if you stand where that porch would have been, they are confronted with an almost continuous vista. Today, these paintings are considerably faded, but if you look closely at them, it is just possible to pick out salient features such as foliage and a peacock. Perspective mural paintings on exterior walls, canvases, or garden buildings were a manifestation of the garden's ability to manipulate or disrupt reality by seeming to extend the space of the garden. But at the same time, some of their creators, such as Salomon de Caus, saw them as not forcing nature to submit to art, but rather as showcasing rationalism by using geometry and perspective to reveal the laws of nature. The cloisters are liminal spaces which seem to dissolve the boundaries between the house and garden. On entering the house, you find yourself in the Great Hall with its double-height ceiling and round gallery above. And if you turn left and continue your journey across the hall, you encounter the Great Staircase, which leads you up to the main rooms for entertaining, including the Long Gallery. The Great Staircase at Ham is, for me, one of the most interesting display sites in the house. Remodelled during the 1630s by William Murray, the staircase is a work of art in its own right, with its elaborate carved military emblems which reference the victories and spoils of ancient Rome, among other things. Its statement of magnificence and power is complemented by the presence of large paintings hung in auricular frames and by the views it offers as visitors ascend. The chief view is out onto the cherry garden we have just seen. Remarkably, the paintings which are displayed here in their elaborate and unpainted auricular frames have hung here since the 17th century, and although they were acquired by different generations. These include a large painting of a naval skirmish at the Battle of Lepanto, which you can see towards the bottom left of the screen. There's also a religious work and several mythological paintings, including a representation of Venus and Adonis. These paintings speak of love, faith, and valour as if preparing the visitor or inducting them to the values they will find here before introducing them to the inner circle and of faces and names of the portraits that are present in the Long Gallery. The staircase was not merely a functional piece of architecture, it was a statement that invited a gradual procession from the quotidian to the sublime experience, beckoning the visitor to pause upon its landing to appreciate the large works of art which hung here, enter their worlds, gaze from the windows out onto the exclusive space of the private walled garden below, absorb the military carvings on the balustrade and prepare themselves to enter the grand suite of rooms above. Lit by windows during the day and the flickering lights of candles at night, it would have played spectacularly with light and shadow, and the play of different kinds of light on its wooden and gilded surfaces and on the white painted ceilings with their wreaths of bay leaves. So it was also highly tactile. It invited the visitor to ascend, but also to touch the feel of the smooth wooden handrail, perhaps tracing the fruit cornucopias beneath the hand, in which a space was allotted for a candle. So this, again, is quite a liminal space. It's one of transition, but also one of discovery in its own right. Proceeding up the stairs and through a suite of rooms, we then arrive at the Long Gallery. Oops, sorry, that's the slides are out of order. I do apologise. So this is the view from the staircase, and you can see the Bacchus there that we've seen earlier. That's the view of the cherry garden. And this is a view taken from the cherry garden, so it's a slightly closer view of the Bacchus there. And if you're looking at the house behind the hornbeam arbour, the middle of the house where you can see a sort of yellower cornice and you can see three windows that seem to gradually ascend, that's actually the space of the grand staircase, so that's where you're looking out. So this is the Long Gallery. This space was part of the original 1610 house and has windows at either end which offer commanding views out over the front and rear gardens. This would have been a space for recreation, such as walking, sewing, reading and playing games, especially in inclement weather, and for entertaining guests. Interestingly, no artworks are mentioned in the earliest inventory of this room, taken in 1654, although we cannot assume from that that they weren't here. But what is there is furniture, 3 great looking glasses and a billiard board. The billiard table is of particular interest as it not only suggests how the space was actively being used by the family, but reveals an invisible link between the gallery and the gardens it overlooked. Billiards in this period were essentially a miniature version of a garden game brought indoors. So a little bit like the gallery at Moreton Hall, it's a way of taking outside things and bringing them in. The space was, of course, also used to display paintings, and an inventory of 1679 lists 22 paintings with carved gilt frames in this space, which would mainly have comprised large contemporary portraits, including a portrait of Charles I by Van Dyck, given to William Murray by the King. The presence of such an illustrious artist and sitter demonstrates how galleries were designed to be outward in prospect in both a physical and a symbolic sense. The gallery looks out upon the world, but it is also a stage on which social aspirations and ambitions, represented by the portraits and the acts of patronage and gift giving, are carried out. The 17th century inventory bills and receipts of Ham House reveal some interesting details about how the function of this room may have changed over time. So if you cast your eye to the back of the gallery where you can see the window and then look over to the left, you will see that the wall panelling on the left-hand side has been brought forward, so it's actually slightly offset. And that's because in 1639, William Murray renovated the space, blocking up chimneys and removing fireplaces in order to make the space more symmetrical, in order to have more space to hang paintings. And at the same time, that panelling was painted very dark brown, almost black, presumably to set off the colours of the paintings in their carved gilt frames. For me, the removal of the fireplaces suggests that this space was becoming increasingly about public display rather than personal comfort, and may be an indicator of the increasing importance of the artworks in this space. This is possibly a reflection of broader trends in the 17th century, in which the long gallery was still very much a multi-purpose space, but it had also become increasingly associated with practices of looking and the display of art. So this grand semi-public space was also a conduit through which occupants passed on their way to more private and exclusive spaces, which is an architectural feature also seen in Renaissance Italy. One of these spaces is the Green Closet, a small ornate room containing miniature and small paintings, including portraits and landscapes. 53 paintings are recorded here in 1679. The Green Closet was influenced by the Italian studiolo, which were often placed near grand public rooms, even if they themselves were exclusive spaces. The original Green Closet could only be entered from the gallery and was locked when not on display. The single window that is now in the space faces north, again based on Italian architectural and art theory, but also presumably to help avoid light damage to the paintings. Through this window, the closet shares a view of the garden, the south side of the gardens, with the gallery, and its green hangings, recorded as green velvet in 1679, painted ceiling and coving depicting scenes from classical mythology, some taking place in ruined landscapes, also express the desire to be outward in prospect, despite the clearly private nature of this space. The Green Closet commands a view of the Platts, 8 closely shorn lawn plots, bisected by wide gravel paths, and perhaps all that green in the room is in some way also a reflection of these lawns, which would have been an incredible luxury for their time. We can just see one there at the moment, but these would have, of course, demanded huge amounts of labour in the 17th century. That one of the plats that you can see here, you can probably see that scrollwork designs have been mown into the plots to help enliven their appearance for a contemporary visitor, but also to evoke the spirit of 17th century grandeur. Many of the plots have also been sown with flowers to bloom in sequence. And although the gardens at Ham would probably have used plain lawns in the 17th century, the connections between gardens, textiles, and embroidery were noted by 17th century commentators such as John Evelyn, who stated that flower beds should resemble embroidered cushions, and that a variety of flowers should be planted to bloom in sequence so that the beds appear furnished at all seasons. So it really does reflect 17th century thinking, even if this is not quite what was there in the 1670s. Ham boasted a really extensive network of garden spaces, which can be seen from this plan of 1671-2 by John Sleezer and Jan Wick. If we start from the bottom and the depiction of the River Thames, we get a sense of the tree-lined avenue which once led to the house. The forecourt is depicted just above this, and over to the left of the house, we see the walled geometric garden. On the opposite or south side of the house, we can see a long terrace which was used for displaying plants in pots. Moving upwards, we encounter one of the largest spaces, which is the 8 lawn plots bisected by gravel paths. Beyond this is an area called the wilderness, and despite its name, you can see from this plan that it was not terribly wild. Although it would have been maze-like, its design is very formal. The strip of land on the right of the image represents the kitchen gardens, and the strip on the left, no longer owned by the National Trust, and the only piece of land, I believe, to have been lost to the estate since the 17th century, except perhaps the stables, was known in the 17th century as the Melancholy Walk, a long tree-lined avenue, so a little bit similar to a long gallery outdoors. The gardens at Ham were restored in the late 20th century to an approximation of their appearance in the 17th century. However, this painting by Henry Dancoats of about 1675 to 9, which actually hangs in Ham House, offers us a bit of a clue as to how the spaces might have been used during this era, as well as what they looked like. So in the painting of the wilderness, the Duke and Duchess are just arriving to greet their guests who are sitting, strolling or conversing in the wilderness. The entrance to this space is marked by 2 statues of Mercury and Fortuna, and a servant bows to them as they enter. The first space they have passed through are the lawns or plots bisected by gravel paths at the front of the house. These would have been used for public entertaining, and their orderly appearance matched the more symmetrical south side of the house, which was constructed in the 1670s. So in this image, the guests have retired to the quietest and most remote part of the garden. The wilderness follows a formal plan of small compartments filled with trees and shrubs, with winding paths running between them. This space was also used to display a series of statues on pedestals, as well as plants in boxes, seen here. Unfortunately, none of these have survived. Like the long gallery, this was a space for walking and talking and being private in, but unlike the gallery, the winding paths, restricted fields of vision and appearance of statues was designed to surprise guests. So rather like the interior rooms we've seen, the different parts of the garden had quite different functions and were conceived almost as compartments. Divisions between these compartments ranged from the solid. So I don't know if you can see this very well, but if you look at the image of the house, and then look over to your right, you will see a low brick wall with a little doorway in it. And that's the wall that would have been around the Duchess's private garden. So some of these divisions are very solid indeed, like that one. Others are very porous, as between the plots and wilderness. And I just wanted to show you this. This is the space as it appears today. So it's an interesting recreation of what we can see in the Dancoats painting. So just to wrap up then, in conclusion, I think that there was a profound conceptual relationship between early modern gardens and galleries as viewing places from which to order and examine the world, evident in contemporary discourse from at least the mid-16th century. This was complemented by spatial proximity, visual dialogue, and comparable display strategies, but also extended to a social relationship. Galleries and gardens are best understood as part of a larger constellation of cultural practices which were embedded within the lived experience of the early modern domestic sphere. Much art historical and museological emphasis has been placed on establishing the first dedicated spaces of display, but this tends to obscure the significance of domestic spaces and their influence on later public galleries. Gardens and art galleries shared a symbiotic relationship during the early modern era. Just as it is challenging to pin down the concept of an early modern art gallery in this period, which, as we have seen, was fluid and malleable, so were the spaces used to display works of art, their thresholds and borders. They were ambiguous, even contradictory, neither inside nor outside, neither fully public nor entirely private, introspective yet outward-looking. We've seen how gardens and galleries were not isolated cultural performances, but were perceived as complementary spaces from the 16th century onwards, and how this relationship was due to more than just spatial proximity and convenience. We've seen how early modern people conceived of both garden and gallery as codependent vantage points for understanding the world. Finally, we've seen how a great house like Ham in the 17th century harnessed a broad variety of interconnected interior and exterior spaces for the display of art. It's my hope that this research will provide or furnish a new way of thinking about galleries, and asks whether by seeing garden spaces as mere extensions of the gallery, might we be missing a relationship between gardens and galleries which is deeper and more profound. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, for a most fascinating paper. Pippa, are you going to do the questions? Do we have some questions? I am looking here. I don't see any questions yet. So if anybody has questions or comments to make.
Perhaps I could ask one just to start. I've always been amused by whether Bacon was actually approving of the number of statues, or was he disapproving with his resurrection comment?
Yeah, it's hard to know, because the source for me, I mean, it's an often quoted source, but it comes from a man who's writing, I think, 60 or 70 years later after the fact. And from what I know about Bacon, and he could be quite cutting in his remarks about galleries and gardens that he didn't like. For example, he really didn't like topiary. He thought it was just awful. And he says, you know, these things are but toys. I think that's also from it might be from his essay on gardens, or it might be from Gesta Graeorum. But it's very hard to know, because it does seem a little bit out of character for him. I can imagine him being surprised by it, yes. But I don't know. He was quite a dour man, so it's hard to know whether he really would have said something like that.
Or whether he thought he was being funny.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a really hard source to interpret, and I've not been able to find much to substantiate that. Although he certainly was a really frequent visitor to Arundel House, and so he would have been familiar with it. So you're thinking, you know, was this his first visit, or, you know, what's really going on? Certainly, the fact that that garden appears on contemporary maps of London from around that time is interesting, because it suggests it was a local landmark, it was known about. And something I've been thinking about lately is there's a musician called Tamsin Lewis, and she's been recreating the dances, English dances by John Playford, and he named a lot of them after sort of famous London landmarks. And one of them was Ham House. It's a piece called Ham House or Cherry Garden. You can listen to it on YouTube. It's quite a nice piece of music. But I wonder if there was also one for Arundel House. Obviously, those gardens are not there anymore.
That'd be fun, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I've got a question here from Max Caligula. I know Ham House fairly well. I'm curious, why was the geometric garden called Cherry Garden? Was it an orchard to begin with? I'm also aware that Ham House was inspired by Dutch garden design. Was it referenced on Het Lo, which you also mentioned? Thank you.
Yeah, no, those are really good questions. So the first question, the reason it was known as the Cherry Garden is because at one time there were a large number of cherry trees grown in that space. So in the Duchess's time, in the 1670s, there were at least 84 cherry trees grown in the space. It is something that I think sometimes confuses contemporary visitors. And I think at one point, a couple of cherry trees were put there in pots. But it's still known as the Cherry Garden from all those days ago. It's a difficult space, I think, to it's very hard to know what the original appearance was. I mean, there's certain features that we know were there. We know that it was a wall, but the plan, which I'll go back to. So if we look at the plan, so the little sort of cross-hatched rectangle just to the left of the house, that's the representation of the space. But it's not clear whether that is a design, whether it's just cross-hatching, whether, for example, it's a plan that actually was realised or never was. So it's a sort of imagined reconstruction of the space, but it may have looked quite different with sort of cherry trees espaliered on the walls and things. So the second question, about the Dutch influence, that's really interesting. I believe there was some Dutch influence on Ham. It's something I'd like to know more about. I mean, I know as well that the National Trust, I think in the 90s, shortly after they took over, seemed to have a relationship with Palace Hetlow, and they were talking back and forth about gardens and things. I think they may still have a relationship now. So there's definitely something there. And having visited Hetlow, it is it's a series of quite sort of, although it was a royal palace, it was really, it developed from a hunting lodge, so it's quite modest by palatial standards. And there's a lot, again, of sort of connected garden spaces, but it's almost like his and hers gardening, because there's a space on one side, which is the King's Garden, where he would receive a lot of guests and I think play games, ball games and things. But on the other side, you've got the Queen's Garden, which is this more sort of enclosed space with the big sort of wobbly berceau. So there are some slight differences, but I think that there was Dutch influence on Ham. I believe Elizabeth may have been to Holland at some point as well. Certainly there's, I think, Italian and French influence as well.
There's another question from Caroline Aiken. She asks how the weather affects the use of the indoor and outdoor spaces.
Does in the contemporary period?
She just
or just generally.
Well, I imagine she meant at that time.
Yeah.
Would you use the indoor gallery in preference? I guess, I don't know.
Yeah, I suppose it is something I haven't come across in Elizabeth's letters, but I have come across in other contemporary gardens. So a lot of the people that that went to Italy and looked at gardens there and really admired what was done there, especially with open loggias and like these very, very open spaces, they often came back and wrote about their experiences and said, we love it, but it would never work in England. It's too rainy, the statues will go all sort of green and horrible, and we have to sort of design more enclosed spaces. At Ham, there was an orangery, and parts of that building still, I think the building still survives. I think the interior has changed quite a bit and is now the cafe for the property. So there were spaces that were used to house plants that needed special care and attention, things like orange and lemon trees and things like that, which would have been probably displayed quite proudly outside on the terrace, which is the sort of long line at the back of the house just before you get to the lawn plots. So and you would have had some cover in places like the Wilderness, and maybe on the Melancholy Walk. So I think that the way I think of Ham and a lot of 17th century gardens is that they're designed to provide, I suppose, slightly a variance of experiences and different, and sometimes that involves invoking emotions and things as well. So they like the sort of contrast of being out on a big wide open space, which might be quite sunny, and then going into a really secluded, dark and shady space. And that's something that I think 18th century gardeners also use, but without quite such rigid compartmentalization. So I think it's a really good point, because obviously the weather will massively impact your experience of the garden. But I haven't come across it specifically what they did, except for sort of taking plants inside to protect them.
There's a question from somebody with initials EBTS UK saying there's still some cherry trees along the wall to the front of the house, which you probably know.
Okay, yes, yeah, I thought there were still some trees round about. That's good to know.
And then from Richard Spencer Smith, I thought one purpose of the gallery was for dancing. I remember the gallery at Haddon Hall is described as such. What relationship might there be between dance and art display in galleries? And how might the garden views relate to dance?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, that's something I haven't explored in depth yet, but I'm really interested in the idea that that gardens do create certain patterns of movement, so they do funnel you in certain directions, or that the width of the paths also dictate how many people can walk abreast. So one of the things I was thinking of doing, and I've had a little bit of a look, and I found a few things on this, but I'd be interested if anyone suggests any other sources to look at. Are things like etiquette books, which sometimes tell you things like how you should walk in a gallery and how many should walk abreast, and if there's two people walking already, where should you walk and what should the patterns be. So you're absolutely right, long galleries would have been used for dancing as well. I got terribly excited once at one house, I think it was Hardwick Hall, where I saw a pattern in the ceiling that was repeated in the parterre, but it turned out that was a much, much later thing. So it was a bit of a red herring. But I think both galleries and gardens do choreograph a particular kind of movement. And I think there are really interesting connections between what it says if you walk into that space with a particular person, because galleries don't tend to lead anywhere. They're just places to sort of really walk up and down. And there are also spaces in at Ham, as you can see, things like the wilderness, which are quite secluded. I did read an account once, I think, from Elizabethan times of firstly an ambassador who was received in Elizabeth I's private garden, and he accorded that as the most signal honour he could receive, because he said that is the most private space she could possibly have met me. But then I also counted other accounts, and I think there is a scholar who's looked at Tudor privacy in the Long Gallery. I think her surname might be Orwin, Orwin, Lena Orwin, I think. And it might have been her that said this, but she said that looking at her documents, she'd found that there were accounts of people actually being suspected of conspiracy because they had been seen walking into a more secluded space. And just like when you have sort of closet spaces and you retreat into a closet, I suppose it reminds me a bit of my dad, who would retreat into his shed with a cup of tea, and then you know not to disturb him. But there's a very sort of public way of being in private, where when you retreat into one of these spaces, people know that you're not to be disturbed, but that also actually lays you open to some suspicion. So I think the dance thing is something I would like to follow up on, and I also wonder if it's also perhaps related to a culture of surveillance in early modern gardens as well, especially given the sort of quite turbulent times that people were living in as well.
Thank you. A question from Charlotte Wetton. I'm wondering if you found any insights as to how these elite spaces were used by working people, servants, or even working class visitors. For example, would a servant be able to enjoy the gardens?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't at this stage. I would like to know that. I know that there was a fairly large gardening team at Ham in the 17th century. Some of them are named in the inventories. And that's actually one of the difficulties I've had, because Ham is it's very, very richly documented. But a lot of the letters and things you read, it really relate to sort of everyday business, paying bills and things, and you don't always get a sense of how particular spaces were used. So that again is a question I would really like to know the answer to, is sort of who was allowed to go where. I do have sort of bigger questions as well, as sort of how many people were working in these spaces. So when I can, and when it's sort of reopened, I'd really like to go back to a particular archive called the Buckminster Park Archive in Grantham, which has sort of records of who the servants were, what they were paid, what their jobs were and things. So I was thinking, again, I haven't quite got there, but that's where I would like to start my research in that area, because I think that is a really important question. I'm sorry that I can't give you a better answer.
The question from Mary Seals, she just asked for the name of the house in Shropshire.
Was that Little Morton Hall?
I think it might.
Yeah, that's in Cheshire.
Cheshire. Is that all right, Mary? And then Maria, they've underplanted the plats in a checkered pattern. So this spring it was alive with crocuses, tulips, more reminiscent of medieval flowery lawns at Ham House. She says she's talking about. And
yes, that's right. Yes. So yeah, you've had these sort of displays, and I think some have been planted with sort of more like wildflower meadows. So they don't look quite as they would have done, but that also is something that really adds to biodiversity as well. So I think it's a really interesting time for the gardens in Ham, because they are changing and being So rather than sort of planting plants that are strictly, sort of historically accurate cultivars, it's more about thinking about what plants can best evoke the 17th century, but which are actually maybe better for the soil, work better with the space. Because the gardens at Ham were one of the first. I think I spoke to the head gardener recently, and she advised me it was the second garden to be restored by the National Trust. So at that time, the budget was quite tight, and things were used that perhaps wouldn't be used today, particularly some of the mature trees in the wilderness, which have grown to heights that they that wouldn't have been sort of really quite the same in the 17th century garden. So I think it's a really interesting, balancing act between trying to evoke a particular period, but also making it work for the contemporary visitor and the local environment.
Mary says thank you for the name of the house.
That's fine, yeah.
Comment from Alan Simpson. Thank you for an excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I look forward to the questions.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yeah.
And maybe that's a clue for us all to say thank you.
Yeah, I think so.
For a most wonderful presentation and wonderfully fluid information to the questions as well, to kind of create further insight into it. So we thank you very, very much indeed. And if everybody would unmute themselves, we can clap and give a little applause to Stephanie.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful audience, and there's been so many good questions that will help me, I think, as I go through and try to look up, sort of chase down some of these leads.
Well, lots of thank yous and well done's coming on up. So,
thank you very much.
It's for us to say thank you and goodbye to everyone for the summer holiday. I'm trying to put here again a little information about the summer. The autumn term, but I can't seem to manage to do it. So if you scroll all the way to the top of the chat box, you'll find information about next term, just a little bit. Garden history, the autumn term. The theme is going to be conversations across continents, the movement of garden ideas, styles, and plants across the globe. It gives the dates there. The first date is the 7th of October. We'll send out the program when we have it finished. It's not going to be able to be posted on the IHR website very easily, so we'll just mail it out to the mailing list. Next term, all the meetings will be on Zoom again, so we'll see you back on Zoom, or you'll see us. Unfortunately, we don't see you. It leaves us to hope you have a wonderful summer, and we look forward to seeing you on the 7th of October at 6 p.m. And you'll have the program ahead of time. So thank you.